Wind howled through the jagged Colorado peaks, carrying the bitter promise of an unforgiving winter. Clara sat shivering on the wooden bench of a buckboard wagon, clutching her tattered wool shawl against the biting frost. She had traded her velvet gowns and high society balls for a life of grueling hardship, bound by holy matrimony to a wild, unkempt mountain man. High society whispered that she was marching toward a miserable, frozen grave, cast out by a bankrupt father to settle his debts. Yet, as the creaking wagon crested a treacherous, mist-shrouded ridge, the rugged trapper beside her pulled the reins. He did not point toward a decaying log hovel, but toward a sprawling, slate-roofed Victorian estate hidden entirely beneath the clouds, a staggering secret that would shatter her reality and rewrite her destiny. The Windsor Hotel in Denver, Colorado was a monument to the reckless wealth of 1,885. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the imported Persian rugs, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and French perfume. Yet for Clara Harrington, the opulent lobby felt like the antechamber to a prison. She stood rigid near the grand staircase, her posture perfect, her face a mask of porcelain indifference, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her father, Arthur Harrington, paced frantically before her. Once a proud titan of the Western expansion, Arthur had wagered his entire fortune on a doomed railroad venture alongside the ambitious industrialist William Jackson Palmer. When the venture collapsed beneath the weight of unpaid bonds and treacherous mountain geology, the Harrington fortune evaporated overnight. The vultures of Denver society had circled swiftly. Debts were called in. The family's sprawling estate on Capitol Hill was seized. Arthur was left with nothing but a mountain of debt and a beautiful, marriageable daughter. "He will be here soon, Clara," Arthur muttered, dabbing his glistening forehead with a silk handkerchief. "You must understand, I had no choice. The banks were prepared to send me to the territorial prison. This man, he bought the debt in its entirety. He holds the promissory notes." Clara did not look at him. She stared straight ahead, her voice barely above a whisper. "You sold me, father, to a stranger. I secured your future," Arthur hissed, though his eyes darted away in shame. "He is a man of the frontier. Rough, perhaps, but he has means. Raw means." Before Clara could reply, the heavy mahogany doors of the Windsor Hotel swung open, letting in a gust of chilling autumn air. The low murmur of the lobby's elite clientele ceased instantly. Into the pristine, gilded room stepped a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the unforgiving granite of the Rocky Mountains. He was incredibly tall, his broad shoulders stretching the limits of a weathered, fringed buckskin coat. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and his hair hung past his collar, wild and untamed. Mud caked his heavy leather boots, leaving a trail of the wilderness on the immaculate rugs. But it was his eyes that arrested Clara. Beneath the brim of a battered Stetson, his eyes were a striking, piercing gray like the color of a winter storm right before the snow falls. They were sharp, intelligent, and completely unapologetic as they swept across the room and locked onto her. This was Jeremiah Dalton. Whispers erupted among the silk-clad ladies and suited gentlemen. "A savage," they muttered. "A mountain hermit." Jeremiah ignored them all, walking with a predatory grace straight toward Arthur Harrington. "Dalton," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly. He extended a hand. Jeremiah did not take it. Instead, he reached into the deep pocket of his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto a nearby marble-top table. It hit the stone with a deafening metallic thud that made several nearby patrons jump. The leather ties came loose, spilling a fortune in raw, uncut gold nuggets onto the pristine surface. "The final payment for the Harrington notes," Jeremiah said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, rough as tree bark but surprisingly steady. "The debt is settled." Arthur stared at the gold, his hands shaking. And my daughter?" Jeremiah finally turned his gaze fully upon Clara. She forced herself not to shrink back. She lifted her chin, meeting his storm-gray eyes with all the defiance she could muster. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, taking in the pale silk of her dress, the trembling of her hands, and the rigid pride in her posture. "The magistrate is waiting down the street," Jeremiah said simply. "Bring only what you can carry in one trunk, Miss Harrington. We ride for the San Juan Range before noon. The wedding was a brief, sterile affair in a dusty office smelling of stale ink and old paper. There were no flowers, no music, no joyous tears. Clara repeated the vows with a hollow voice, binding herself to a man whose last name she had only learned that morning. When the magistrate pronounced them husband and wife, Jeremiah did not attempt to kiss her. He merely tipped his hat to the official, picked up Clara's solitary leather trunk with effortless ease, and led her out into the cold reality of her new life. She was no longer Clara Harrington, the darling of Denver society. She was the property of a mountain man, destined for a life of isolation, dirt, and endless labor in the ruthless wilderness. Or so she believed. The journey out of Denver began under a sky the color of bruised iron. Clara sat beside Jeremiah on the hard wooden seat of a heavy freight wagon, pulled by two massive draft horses, as the city faded behind them, replaced by the rolling foothills and eventually the jagged, towering teeth of the Rocky Mountains. The silence between them stretched into hours, then days. Jeremiah proved to be a man of agonizingly few words. He spoke only to give necessary commands or to point out hazards on the trail. Yet, Clara could not help but observe him. He handled the heavy wagon and the massive horses with a quiet, dominant expertise. When they made camp, he was ruthlessly efficient, building a smokeless fire, setting up a canvas lean-to to block the wind, and providing her with the best portion of the game he hunted. He was gruff and unpolished, eating with his hunting knife and sleeping on the cold ground. But he never raised his voice to her, nor did he make any of the crude advances she had dreaded. By the end of the first week, the elevation had climbed drastically, and the air grew thin and painfully cold. They were entering the high passes of the San Juan Mountains, a place where civilization surrendered to raw, untamed nature. The trail narrowed to a treacherous shelf carved into the side of a sheer cliff. Below them, a river rushed over jagged rocks, looking like a thin silver ribbon from such a dizzying height. It was on the 8th day that the mountain truly bared its teeth. They were crossing a high, exposed saddle when the temperature plummeted in the span of minutes. The bruised sky tore open, unleashing a ferocious, blinding blizzard. The wind shrieked through the canyons, hurling needle-sharp ice into their faces. Visibility dropped to a mere few feet. "Hold on!" Jeremiah roared over the screaming wind. Clara clutched the wooden edge of the seat, her fingers numb inside her thin leather gloves. The horses whinnied in panic, tossing their massive heads, their hooves slipping on the rapidly icing rock. For a terrifying second, the wagon slid backward toward the precipice. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the fatal plunge into the abyss. Suddenly, Jeremiah thrust the reins into her hands. "Keep them tight," he commanded. Before she could process his words, he vaulted over the side of the wagon. Through the blinding whiteout, Clara saw him rush to the lead horse. He grabbed the heavy leather harness with bare hands, planting his boots into the icy mud. The muscles in his broad back strained against his wet buckskins as he physically anchored the terrified beasts, using his own massive strength to keep the wagon from slipping over the edge. He spoke to the horses in low, calm, commanding tones that somehow cut through the howling gale. Slowly, agonizingly, he led them forward, walking backward through the knee-deep snow, pulling the wagon inch by inch away from the cliff's edge. Clara watched him in awe. The sheer physical power of the man was terrifying, yet in that moment, he was her sole protector against the wrath of the world. After what felt like hours, Jeremiah guided the wagon into the shelter of a dense pine grove and up against the side of a massive rock outcropping. Nestled against the stone was a crude, dilapidated line shack, a rough log structure used by trappers or cattlemen during storms. Jeremiah practically carried Clara inside. The interior was freezing, smelling of dust, old animal hides, and rot. There was a single rusted iron stove and a bed frame strung with sagging rope. Clara collapsed onto a wooden stool, her body trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw ached. The adrenaline faded, leaving only a cold, crushing despair. This was her life now, surviving by a thread in a rotting shack at the edge of the world. Tears, hot and fast, began to spill down her freezing cheeks. Jeremiah returned a moment later, his arms full of dry firewood he had somehow scrounged. He paused, seeing her weeping in the dark. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his hardened features. He did not offer empty comfort. Instead, he worked swiftly to ignite a roaring fire in the stove. Once the iron began to radiate heat, he approached her. Clara flinched, but he only unclasped his own heavy, fur-lined bearskin coat and wrapped it securely around her shoulders. The coat dwarfed her, smelling of wood smoke and pine, but it was incredibly warm. He knelt before her, pulling a small, tightly sealed tin from his saddlebag. From it, he produced a delicate pinch of loose leaves. Within minutes, he handed her a steaming tin cup. Clara took a sip and gasped. It was not bitter cowboy coffee or pine needle tea. It was fine, imported Earl Grey tea, the exact blend she used to drink in the parlors of Denver. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with confusion. Where did you get this? Jeremiah met her gaze, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. A man can appreciate good tea, Clara. Drink. You need the warmth. He turned away to tend the horses, leaving Clara clutching the tin cup, wrapped in his massive coat, staring into the flames. The savage mountain man who had bought her like cattle had just saved her life with brute force, only to serve her aristocratic tea in a rusted tin cup. Nothing about Jeremiah Dalton made sense. Clara awoke the next morning to the smell of frying bacon and the crackle of a warm fire. Sunlight streamed through the single, grime-covered window of the line shack, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Jeremiah was already awake, sitting near the stove, sharpening a large hunting knife with a whetstone. Clara sat up, the heavy bearskin coat falling to her waist. Her muscles ached from the brutal journey, and her mind was heavy with the reality of her surroundings. She looked around the grim, drafty cabin. The log walls were chinked with dry mud. The floor was hard-packed dirt, and the roof looked as though it might collapse under a heavy snowfall. She took a deep breath, swallowing her despair. If this was to be her home, she would not spend her days weeping. She was a Harrington, and she had pride. I suppose I should learn how to cook on that stove, Clara said, her voice steady though it lacked its usual refined cadence. Jeremiah paused his sharpening, glancing at her. Eat first. We have a few miles left. Clara frowned. Left? This isn't your home? No, he replied shortly, wiping the blade on a rag. He stood up, towering over the small room. I need to check the wagon wheel. It took a beating on the ice. Stay inside. He stepped out into the crisp mountain air. Clara ate her breakfast in silence, her curiosity piqued. If this wretched place wasn't his home, what was? Did he live in a cave? A tent? Seeking a distraction, she decided to tidy the small space. She began to stack the few items Jeremiah had unpacked the night before. As she moved his heavy leather saddlebag, the buckle came undone, spilling its contents onto the dirt floor. Clara knelt to gather the items, freezing when she saw what had tumbled out. It was not traps, or ammunition, or cheap chewing tobacco. There was a thick, leather-bound book, a volume of Shakespeare's tragedies, its pages worn with love and frequent reading. Next to it lay a pocket watch. Clara picked it up. It was heavy, solid gold, and intricately engraved. She pressed the latch, and the cover popped open. The inside was pristine, bearing a hallmark from a master jeweler in London, but it was the folded piece of thick parchment that truly made her heart stop. She unfolded it cautiously. It was a formal letter, bearing the official seal of the First National Bank of Denver. She scanned the elegant handwriting. It referenced a massive transfer of funds, discussing stock options and mining dividends. At the bottom, it was signed by Horace Tabor, the legendary Silver King of Colorado. The letter was addressed to Mr. J.D. Dalton, Esquire. Clara's breath hitched. Esquire? Stock options? Horace Tabor? She stared at the dirt floor, her mind spinning wildly. The man outside, currently covered in mud and horse grease, possessed items that rivaled the wealthiest men she had ever known in Denver. Who was he? Before she could process the revelation, the wooden door creaked open. Jeremiah stood in the frame, his massive silhouette blocking the sun. He saw the letter in her hand. For a fraction of a second, his jaw tightened, but he made no move to take it from her. The wheel is fixed, he said, his voice flat. Pack your trunk. We're leaving. Clara carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the bag. She looked at him, her fear replaced by a burning, intense curiosity. "Where are we going, Jeremiah?" "Home," he said simply. They rode for another 2 hours. The trail completely vanished, replaced by a dense, almost impenetrable forest of ancient blue spruce and towering ponderosa pines. Jeremiah navigated the wilderness purely by instinct, guiding the wagon through ravines and over hidden streams. Clara sat in bewildered silence, the gold watch and the letter burning in her memory. Eventually, the trees began to thin, and they entered a narrow, towering box canyon. The walls were sheer red rock, rising hundreds of feet into the air, effectively blocking out the rest of the world. It felt like they were driving into the belly of the earth. The canyon twisted and turned, cloaked in deep shadow. "There's nothing out here," Clara murmured, almost to herself. "We are miles from any settlement." Jeremiah did not answer. He merely urged the horses around one final sharp bend in the rock wall. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The narrow, dark canyon suddenly exploded into blinding light, opening into a massive, hidden valley. The valley floor was carpeted in lush, emerald-green grass, completely untouched by the harsh snows that plagued the higher passes. A crystal-clear river wound its way through the center, glittering like diamonds in the afternoon sun. But it was not the natural beauty that stole Clara's breath. It was the structure sitting perfectly in the center of the valley. It was a mansion, a sprawling, breathtaking, 3-story Victorian mansion. It was a masterpiece of Queen Anne architecture, painted in rich, elegant tones of forest green and cream. It boasted asymmetrical turrets, wide wraparound porches supported by carved columns, and towering chimneys of cut stone. In the center of the facade, a massive stained glass window caught the sun, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the manicured lawns that surrounded the estate. It was an architectural impossibility, a palace of immense wealth, hidden away in a secret valley where no map could ever find it. Jeremiah pulled back on the reins, bringing the massive draft horses to a halt at the edge of a crushed stone driveway. The silence of the valley was profound, broken only by the gentle rushing of the river. Clara sat frozen on the wagon seat, staring at the mansion, then turning her wide, shocked eyes toward the rugged, dirty mountain man sitting beside her. "You," she stammered, her voice failing her. "What is this place?" Jeremiah Dalton looked at the sprawling estate, his storm-gray eyes softening for the first time since she had met him. He took off his battered Stetson, running a hand through his wild hair. "I told your father I was a man of means, Clara," Jeremiah said quietly. "Welcome to Highover." The heavy oak doors of Highover did not creak as Jeremiah pushed them open. They swung with the silent, oiled precision of bank vaults. Clara stepped over the threshold, the mud of the grueling journey clinging to the hem of her ruined silk dress, and found herself standing in a grand foyer that defied logic. Intricate parquetry floors crafted from rich mahogany and pale maple stretched beneath her feet. Above, a sweeping double staircase curved toward a gallery lined with gas-lit sconces, their brass fixtures gleaming softly. The air smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and burning cedar, a stark, shocking contrast to the rotting pine and damp earth of the line shack they had abandoned only hours before. "Mrs. Higgins," Jeremiah called out, his deep voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. From the shadows beneath the staircase emerged a stout, stern-faced woman, wearing a pristine white apron over a dark woolen dress. Her iron-gray hair was pulled back into an unforgiving bun, but her eyes held a surprising warmth as they settled on Clara. "Mr. Dalton," Mrs. Higgins said, offering a stiff nod before turning to Clara. "And this must be the new Mrs. Dalton. Lord above, child, you look half frozen. Come by the fire at once." Clara could only stare. "You have staff?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just Mrs. Higgins and her husband, Thomas," Jeremiah replied gruffly, dropping Clara's solitary trunk onto the gleaming floor. "Thomas tends the generators and the livestock. Mrs. Higgins runs the house." "Generators?" Clara repeated, her mind reeling. "We are hundreds of miles from a power grid." "We are off the grid, Clara," Jeremiah said, pulling off his heavy buckskin coat to reveal a sweat-stained canvas shirt. "The river powers a hydroelectric dynamo Thomas and I built last spring. Highover is fully self-sustaining." He turned to the housekeeper. "Draw a bath in the master suite, Mrs. Higgins. She needs to thaw." I have business in the study." Without another word, Jeremiah strode down a long hallway, his heavy boots muffled by a thick Persian runner, leaving Clara alone with the housekeeper and 1,000 unanswered questions. An hour later, Clara sat immersed in a clawfoot tub filled with steaming, rose-scented water. The bathroom was a marvel of modern plumbing, outfitted with imported Italian marble and polished copper fixtures. As the heat seeped into her aching bones, the reality of her situation began to crystallize. Jeremiah Dalton was not a destitute mountain savage. He was a phantom titan, a man wielding staggering wealth from the shadows. But the central burning question remained, why? Why hide a palace in a forgotten valley? And more terrifyingly, why buy a disgraced socialite to share it? Dressed in a clean, high-collared velvet gown she found waiting in the massive mahogany wardrobe, Clara descended the sweeping staircase. She found Jeremiah in the study. The room was lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, its center dominated by a massive walnut desk buried under architectural blueprints and financial ledgers. Clara stopped in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. The man sitting behind the desk was nearly unrecognizable. The wild, untamed mountain man was gone. Jeremiah had bathed and shorn the thick, unruly beard, leaving only a neatly trimmed mustache and a strong, square jaw dusted with a shadow of stubble. His wild hair was slicked back, revealing aristocratic, high cheekbones and a small faded scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal corded, muscular forearms, and a dark waistcoat tailored to his broad shoulders. He looked every inch, the ruthless, calculating tycoon. He looked up from a ledger, his storm-gray eyes pinning her in place. "You look better, Clara. The color has returned to your cheeks." Clara stepped into the room, her spine rigid with Harrington pride. "I demand an explanation, Jeremiah. All of it. The gold. This house. The secrecy. And most importantly, why you purchased me from my father like a prize mare." Jeremiah leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his large hands. He did not look away, nor did he apologize. "Your father, Arthur Harrington, is a fool," Jeremiah stated, his tone devoid of malice, merely presenting a fact. He tied his fortune to William Jackson Palmer and the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, believing he could outsmart the Eastern banking syndicates. When the silver market fluctuated and David Moffett called in the regional debts, your father was left exposed. "I am aware of my father's financial ruin," Clara snapped, her eyes flashing. "I was the collateral. You were the sacrifice," Jeremiah corrected quietly. "Arthur was planning to sell your hand to Charles Beecher's syndicate to wipe his slate clean. Beecher is a ruthless, violent man who treats his wives worse than his hounds. You would not have survived a year in his house." Clara blanched, her hands gripping the folds of her velvet skirt. She had heard the whispered rumors of Beecher's cruelties in the parlors of Denver, the mysterious bruises his first wife had covered with heavy powder before her sudden, tragic passing. "And you are my savior?" she asked, her voice laced with bitter sarcasm. "A man who forces me into the wilderness, hiding me away in a gilded cage?" "I am no savior, Clara," Jeremiah said, standing up. He walked toward the massive window overlooking the darkening, snow-dusted valley. "My real name is Jeremiah Dalton. My father was Elias Dalton. Does that name mean anything to you?" Clara searched her memory, her brow furrowing. "Dalton. He owned the silver claims in Leadville before the boom. But he lost them." "He didn't lose them," Jeremiah said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "They were stolen by a consortium of Denver businessmen who manipulated the mining courts. Your father, Arthur Harrington, was the lead signatory on that injunction. They drove my father to ruin, and eventually to an early grave." Clara stepped back, horror washing over her. "You bought me for revenge." Jeremiah turned to face her, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. "Revenge would have been letting Beecher have you, and watching Arthur swing from a federal gallows for fraud. No, Clara, I bought your father's debt because I stumbled upon the mother lode of vein of pure wire gold deep within this canyon, entirely off the surveyed maps. I funneled the wealth through dummy corporations in Chicago, building an empire that Denver society cannot touch and cannot tax. He closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. Clara could smell soap, clean linen, and the faint, lingering scent of pine on his skin. "I bought you, Clara, because I saw you last year at the Brown Palace Gala," Jeremiah confessed, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "I stood in the shadows while your father paraded you like a trophy. I saw the fire in your eyes. You hated them all. You hated the falseness, the greed. You are a survivor, Clara Harrington. And out here, at the edge of the world, I need an equal, not a captive." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray curl from her cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. "This is no cage," he whispered. "This is an empire, and I intend for you to help me rule it." Winter descended upon the San Juan Mountains with a ferocious, unforgiving beauty. For 3 months, Highover was entirely sealed off from the world, entombed in a cathedral of ice and 10-foot snowdrifts. The narrow box canyon that served as their only exit was completely impassable. During these months of isolation, the glacial tension between Clara and Jeremiah began to thaw, replaced by a complex, magnetic dance. Clara did not recline on the velvet chaises and pine for Denver society. Instead, she threw herself into the mechanics of Jeremiah's hidden world. She spent hours in the study, mastering the complex financial ledgers that tracked his vast, anonymous holdings across the Western railways. She discovered that Jeremiah Dalton, the Phantom of the Canyon, secretly controlled nearly 20% of the Colorado freight lines. Jeremiah, in turn, recognized her sharp, analytical mind. He stopped treating her as a fragile aristocrat and began treating her as a partner. They spent their evenings by the roaring hearth in the library, debating shipping routes, the volatile price of silver, and the inevitable expansion of the telegraph lines. But he also insisted she learn to survive the brutal reality of their environment. "The snow will melt, Clara," Jeremiah said one crisp, blindingly bright February morning. They stood on the wide, wraparound porch, the air so cold it burned the lungs. He handed her a heavy, oiled Winchester repeating rifle. "And when it does, the canyon will open. I cannot always be at your side." He taught her how to stand, how to absorb the vicious recoil, and how to breathe between shots. Clara, who had never held anything heavier than a silver teapot, proved to possess a deadly, unflinching aim. When she shattered a glass bottle at 50 yards, Jeremiah smiled, a rare, genuine expression that made Clara's pulse race. Their partnership inevitably bred an intense, undeniable attraction. In the quiet, snow-muffled nights, the vast mansion felt intimate, almost suffocatingly small. When their hands brushed over a shared ledger, or when Jeremiah wrapped his arms around her to correct her shooting stance, the air between them practically crackled. The marriage that had begun as a cold, mercantile transaction was rapidly igniting into a genuine, consuming fire. Then, the spring thaw arrived, bringing with it the melting snows and the ghosts of Arthur Harrington's past. It happened in early May. The valley was exploding with wildflowers, the river swollen and roaring with snowmelt. Clara was on the western ridge, gathering wild mint, her Winchester slung casually over her shoulder. Suddenly, the sharp, unnatural crack of gunfire echoed through the canyon walls. It was not the flat pop of a hunting rifle, but the rapid, heavy report of a Colt revolver. Clara dropped her basket, her blood turning to ice. The shots had come from the lower pasture, near the hydroelectric dynamo where Jeremiah was working. She abandoned the trail, sprinting through the dense pines, branches tearing at her skirts and scratching her face. As she crested a small rise overlooking the river, she saw them, 3 men on horseback. They were not local trappers. They wore the dusters and dark bowler hats favored by the ruthless enforcers of the Eastern Syndicate's hired guns, likely Pinkerton men turned rogue, employed by the creditors Arthur Harrington had desperately tried to evade. They had tracked the flow of Jeremiah's gold back to its hidden source. Jeremiah was pinned behind the heavy iron casing of the dynamo, pinned down by a relentless hail of lead. The wood of the nearby tool shed splintered into the air as the intruders fired indiscriminately, trying to flush him out. Jeremiah had his revolver, returning fire with calculated precision, but he was vastly outgunned. "Rush him," the lead rider bellowed, spurring his horse toward the riverbank. "He's only got 6 shots," The Boetcher Syndicate pays $1,000 for the deed to this valley, and $500 for Dalton's head. Clara did not think. The refined, terrified society girl from Denver had died in the blizzard months ago. She dropped to one knee behind the trunk of a massive blue spruce. She unslung the Winchester, pressing the wooden stock firmly against her shoulder. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, remembering the cadence of Jeremiah's voice. Breathe out. Squeeze, don't pull. She opened her eyes, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The heavy rifle roared, the recoil punching her shoulder. The lead rider's horse reared wildly as the dirt exploded mere inches from its front hooves. The man cursed, fighting for control as the other two riders yanked their reins, their heads snapping toward the ridge. "Sniper!" one of them yelled, pointing toward Clara's hidden position. Before they could adjust their aim, Clara worked the lever action, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and fired again. This time, she didn't aim for the dirt. She aimed for the thick branch of a dead pine hanging directly over the riders. The heavy bullet shattered the wood, sending a massive, jagged limb crashing down onto the trail, separating the lead rider from his men. The distraction was all Jeremiah needed. Exploding from behind the dynamo, he moved with terrifying, predatory speed. He cleared the distance to the isolated lead rider before the man could steady his terrified horse. Jeremiah ripped the man from the saddle, throwing him violently to the ground and disarming him in a single, fluid motion. Seeing their leader incapacitated and a hidden marksman raining fire from the ridge, the remaining two mercenaries exchanged a panicked look. They didn't wait to see if the sniper was reloading. They spurred their horses, turning tail and galloping desperately back toward the narrow mouth of the box canyon, abandoning their mission. Clara lowered the smoking rifle, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. She watched as Jeremiah hauled the remaining mercenary to his feet, tying the man's hands with a length of thick rope from the tool shed. When the threat was neutralized, Jeremiah looked up toward the ridge. Even from a distance, Clara could see the raw, stunned awe in his storm-gray eyes. She stood up slowly, her knees weak, and began the precarious descent down the muddy bank. Jeremiah met her halfway. He didn't say a word. He reached out, his massive hands wrapping around her waist, and pulled her flush against his chest. Clara dropped the rifle, burying her face into the rough canvas of his shirt, listening to the frantic, heavy thudding of his heart. His arms tightened around her, entirely enveloping her in his warmth and strength. "You saved my life," Jeremiah breathed, his voice thick with an emotion that bordered on reverence. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his gaze tracing the dirt and scratches on her cheeks. "You saved mine first," Clara replied, her voice steadying as she looked up into the eyes of the man who was no longer her captor, nor just her husband, but the undisputed center of her world. "They know we are here, Jeremiah. The syndicates know." Jeremiah's expression hardened, the calculating titan returning to his features. But as he looked down at his fiercely defiant wife, a dark, confident smile touched his lips. "Let them come," Jeremiah said, his hand coming up to cup the back of her neck. "They think they are hunting a mountain man. They don't realize they've just declared war on the Queen of Highover." With that, he brought his mouth down on hers. The kiss was not polite or restrained. It was a desperate, claiming fire, born of adrenaline, gunpowder, and a profound, unbreakable bond forged in the wild crucible of the West. Clara kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair, knowing in her soul that she would burn the whole of Denver to the ground before she let anyone take this valley or this man from her. The echo of the gunfire faded into the sprawling expanse of the San Juan Mountains, but the silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and pregnant with the promise of war. Jeremiah stood over the bound Pinkerton mercenary, his broad chest heaving, his storm-gray eyes locked onto the narrow, shadowy slit in the red rock walls that served as the only entrance to their hidden valley. They had won the skirmish, but the element of absolute secrecy, the very shield that had protected the Dalton Empire, was shattered. "They will be back," Jeremiah said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the rushing river. He didn't look at Clara as he spoke. His mind was already moving a dozen steps ahead, calculating angles, ammunition, and time. Charles Boetcher does not accept defeat. He operates on absolute dominion. When these men fail to report back to the telegraph office in Durango, Boettcher will send an army. Clara stood on the muddy bank, the heavy Winchester still clutched in her hands. Her velvet gown was ruined, stained with pine sap and river mud, but she felt entirely transformed. The aristocratic veneer of Denver society had burned away in the crucible of the gunfight. "Then we prepare," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "We hold the canyon." Jeremiah finally turned to look at her. The fierce pride in his eyes was unmistakable, a silent acknowledgement that he had not just found a wife but a commanding partner. He nodded sharply. "Thomas, Mrs. Higgins," he bellowed toward the sprawling Victorian mansion. Within moments, the elderly caretaker and the stern housekeeper were on the lawn. There was no panic in their movements. They were frontier people, hardened by years of surviving on the edge of the world. Jeremiah issued orders with military precision. Thomas was to immediately shut down the hydroelectric dynamo and divert the river's flow to the high reservoir tanks behind the estate. Mrs. Higgins was tasked with blacking out the mansion's windows and stockpiling medical supplies, water, and non-perishable food in the reinforced stone cellar. "And us?" Clara asked, stepping up beside him. "We arm the teeth of this valley," Jeremiah replied. He led her away from the river, toward a massive padlocked timber barn built directly into the side of the sheer granite cliff at the rear of the estate. Clara had assumed it held winter hay and livestock feed, but when Jeremiah produced a heavy brass key and hauled the heavy sliding doors open, the scent that washed over her was not dried grass, but cosmoline, machine oil, and cold iron. It was an armory that would have made the United States cavalry envious. Crates of Winchester repeating rifles, Colt revolvers, and heavy sealed wooden boxes marked "Danger." Blasting gelatin lined the walls, but the centerpiece of the room, sitting beneath a heavy canvas tarp, made Clara's breath hitch. Jeremiah pulled the tarp away to reveal a pristine, brass-barreled 1,883 Gatling gun, mounted on a heavy artillery carriage. "Good Lord, Jeremiah," Clara whispered, stepping toward the devastating piece of machinery. "You anticipated an invasion." "I anticipated the greed of men," he corrected coldly. "When you pull millions of dollars in wire gold from the earth beneath the noses of the most ruthless syndicates in Colorado, you do not rely on locked doors and prayers. You rely on firepower." For the next 48 hours, Highover operated in a state of feverish, calculated preparation. They worked until their hands were blistered and their muscles screamed. Jeremiah hauled crates of dynamite to the narrowest bottleneck of the box canyon, scaling the sheer rock faces with a terrifying agility to plant the charges in strategic fissures. He was rigging the very earth to collapse on command. Clara, meanwhile, methodically cleaned and loaded dozens of rifles, staging them at elevated, fortified positions overlooking the canyon mouth. It was on the night of the second day, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks and painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and blood red, that Clara made the discovery that would shatter her heart. She was in Jeremiah's study, searching his heavy walnut desk for a ledger containing the inventory of their blasting caps. As she pulled open a bottom drawer, a folded piece of yellow Western Union telegraph paper slipped out from between the heavy leather books. It was dated 3 days prior, intercepted by Jeremiah's private wiretap in the valley, before it could reach its intended recipient in Durango. Clara unfolded the flimsy paper. The words printed across it made the blood freeze in her veins. "To Mr. Charles Boettcher, Denver. Stop. Have confirmed location of Dalton Vane. Stop. Daughter is held there. Stop. Will personally guide your men through the San Juan Pass in exchange for full forgiveness of Harrington debts and 20% stake in seized assets. Stop. Arthur Harrington." The paper trembled in her hands. Her father, the man who had sold her to settle his debts, was now selling her out a second time. He wasn't coming to rescue her. He was leading an army of hired killers to slaughter her husband, sack her home, and reclaim his lost fortune over their dead bodies. "I didn't want you to see that," a deep voice said from the doorway. Clara looked up. Jeremiah stood there, his shoulders slumped with a rare exhaustion. The flickering gaslight cast long, harsh shadows across his face. "He's leading them here." Clara choked out, the betrayal hitting her like a physical blow to the chest. "My own father. He knows the terrain from his failed railroad surveys in these mountains. He knows how to bypass the lower snowdrifts. Jeremiah walked slowly across the room, stopping before her. He gently took the telegram from her shaking hands and tossed it onto the glowing embers in the fireplace. It flared brightly for a second, then turned to ash. "Arthur Harrington is a desperate, broken man," Jeremiah said softly, his massive hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs wiping away a single, treacherous tear that had escaped her eye. "He belongs to the past, Clara. The syndicates, the greed, the society that traded you like currency that is the past. We are the future, and tomorrow, we bury the past for good." He pulled her into his chest, and Clara clung to him, burying her face in the rough wool of his shirt. She did not weep for her father. She wept for the last lingering shred of the girl she used to be. When she finally pulled away, her green eyes were hard, reflecting the firelight with a cold, terrifying resolve. "Show me how to fire the Gatling," she commanded. Dawn broke over the San Juan Mountains like a bruised peach, casting long purple shadows across the jagged teeth of the gorge. The freezing morning mist clung to the rushing river, masking the deadly preparations that had transformed the entrance of Highover into a fortress. Clara lay flat on her stomach upon a high, jutting shelf of granite that overlooked the narrowest bottleneck of the trail. The cold stone bit through her heavy wool riding habit, but she barely felt it. Beside her sat the brass-barreled 1,883 Gatling gun, its mechanical perfection gleaming dully in the low light. Her hands rested on the heavy crank, her knuckles white with tension. 50 yards below, hidden entirely behind a fortified barricade of felled ponderosa pines and tightly packed sandbags, Jeremiah crouched in the shadows. A heavy, unlit cigar was clenched between his teeth, and his massive, calloused hand rested firmly on the wooden handle of a plunger, wired directly to the dynamite charges embedded in the cliff face. Then came the sound. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration that shuddered through the ancient rock, the unmistakable thunder of heavily shod hooves. Out of the swirling morning fog, the vanguard of the Betcher Syndicate army materialized. There were nearly 40 men, a terrifying display of Eastern Syndicate wealth and brute force. They were hardened Pinkerton men turned rogue mercenaries, wearing heavy canvas dusters and clutching Winchester repeating rifles. At the head of the column rode Caleb Montgomery, a massive, scarred enforcer known throughout the Colorado territories for his ruthless efficiency. And riding beside him, looking pale, exhausted, and pathetically out of place in a tailored Denver suit, was Arthur Harrington. Clara's jaw locked as she stared down at the man who had given her life. A sickening wave of revulsion washed over her. He had not come to rescue his daughter. He had come to guide a mercenary army to slaughter her husband and steal the unmapped gold vein to save his own miserable reputation. The column halted precisely at the choke point, their horses stamping nervously, sensing the unnatural, absolute stillness of the canyon. Montgomery raised a leather-gloved hand, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning the sheer red rock walls. He sensed the trap, but the arrogance of a 40-man advantage clouded his judgment. "Dalton!" Montgomery's voice boomed like cannon fire, echoing violently off the stone walls. "We know you are back there. The deed to this land is forfeit, signed over legally by the Harrington estate. Come out with your hands empty, and we might let you walk out of these mountains alive." Silence answered him, save for the rush of the icy river beside the trail. "Clara!" Arthur's voice broke the silence next. It was shrill, tinged with a desperate, pathetic panic that echoed miserably in the gorge. "Clara, if you can hear me, run away from him. I have come to bring you home. The debt to Bocher is cleared. We can go back to Denver society." Clara did not hesitate. She slowly pushed herself up to her knees, leaning over the edge of the granite shelf so that the rising sun illuminated her silhouette against the bruised sky. She made no effort to hide. She stood tall, a Winchester strapped across her back, her hands resting casually on the devastating brass weapon of war before her. "I am home, Father." Clara's voice rang out, clear, cold, and echoing with the absolute, unyielding authority of a queen. The mercenaries jerked their heads upward, their horses rearing at the sudden, haunting voice descending from the sky. Arthur stared at his daughter, his jaw dropping in utter shock. This was not the obedient, terrified girl he had traded in. In the Windsor Hotel lobby, this was a woman forged in frontier iron. Clara, Arthur stammered, shrinking back in his expensive leather saddle. You brought murderers to my doorstep, Arthur, Clara declared, her voice devoid of any familial warmth or mercy. You sold me to a monster to save your pride, and now you seek to steal my empire to save your own life. You have no daughter here, only the Lady of Highover, and trespassers in this valley are condemned. Shoot her, Montgomery roared, drawing his Colt Peacemaker and aiming at the ridge. Before Montgomery's finger could graze the trigger, Jeremiah slammed his full weight down on the electrical plunger. The canyon walls instantly erupted in a blinding flash of orange fire and deafening thunder. Thousands of tons of sheer red rock sheared away from the cliff face directly behind the syndicate column, crashing down onto the trail with apocalyptic, bone-shattering force. The ground violently shook, throwing men from their horses as an impenetrable, towering wall of granite boulders permanently sealed their only exit. They were trapped in the bottleneck. "Fire, Clara!" Jeremiah roared from his barricade below. Clara threw her weight into the heavy brass crank. The Gatling gun roared to life, a terrifying mechanical beast spitting a relentless, deafening torrent of heavy lead. She did not aim for the men. She swept the barrel back and forth across the dirt immediately in front of their horses. The sheer volume of fire threw rocks, mud, and splintered wood into the air, creating a chaotic, blinding storm that broke the horses' discipline entirely. The massive animals panicked, bucking wildly and throwing their riders violently to the ground. Utilizing the absolute chaos, Jeremiah stood up from behind his barricade. He didn't fire his rifle. Instead, he gripped a heavy iron wheel mounted to the canyon wall, the emergency spillway release for the massive hydroelectric reservoir situated high above them. With a mighty heave, he spun it open. A deep, groaning rumble vibrated through the earth, louder than the dynamite, louder than the gunfire. "Get to high ground," Montgomery screamed, realizing the terrible sound was not rock, but water. A massive, foaming wall of freezing snowmelt burst from the upper spillways, thundering down the dry gullies and slamming directly into the narrow choke point. The violent force of the icy water swept the legs out from under men and horses alike. Mercenaries tumbled through the churning rapids, their heavy weapons ripped from their hands, washing them helplessly down the rocky riverbed toward the lower, jagged shoals of the gorge. Within minutes, the brutal siege was over. The mighty syndicate army was utterly broken, disarmed, and battered. They dragged themselves onto the muddy banks, freezing, groaning, and staring up at the ridges in absolute primal terror. Jeremiah stepped out from his barricade, his storm-gray eyes cold and merciless. He stopped in front of Caleb Montgomery, who was clutching a broken collarbone. "Take your men and walk out over the eastern scree fields," Jeremiah commanded. "If I ever see a man wearing a Bocher duster within 50 miles of the San Juan Range again, I won't use the water. I will use the lead." Clara descended the carved stone steps from the ridge, coming to stand beside her husband. She looked down at Arthur Harrington, who sat in the mud, weeping into his trembling hands. "Go back to Denver, Arthur," Clara said quietly, feeling only a heavy pity. "Tell the bankers that this valley is guarded by ghosts. If you ever attempt to contact me again, I will personally ensure you hang for your railroad frauds." Arthur nodded weakly, limping away to join the retreating mercenaries. Clara stood beside Jeremiah, the icy mist clinging to their clothes. The main entrance to their valley was permanently destroyed, buried beneath 10,000 tons of rock. Highover was now irrevocably isolated from the known world. Jeremiah reached out, his large hand wrapping securely around hers, pulling her close. The valley was sealed. It was just the two of them against the world. The legend of the hidden valley became a whispered myth in the opulent parlors of Denver, a phantom tale of a disgraced socialite and a millionaire mountain man who vanished into the impenetrable San Juan Mountains. Clara Harrington and Jeremiah Dalton never returned to the suffocating confines of high society. Instead, they ruled their secret, self-sustaining empire in absolute peace, their love forged in the fires of survival and boundless frontier ambition. Highover stood for generations, a magnificent Victorian jewel completely untouched by the encroaching modern world. Protected by the impassable gorge, and the enduring legacy of its fiercely devoted founders. Their story remains a breathtaking testament to the true, untamed spirit of the 1,885 American West. A spectacular romance, where a woman traded as debt rose to become the undisputed queen of the mountains.